Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtadar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to talk to you about a development cycle. The conventional wisdom basically suggests that the pathway to development really starts with becoming independent in the agricultural sector, becoming self-sufficient in the agricultural sector, developing it, and then moving your labor force from the agricultural sector to the factories as you industrialize. And then after you finish industrialization, or rather after reaching a certain point in industrialization, you then basically start moving towards the services sector. And so the pathway of development of most countries has been that way. So if you look at the United States, the biggest and perhaps the most developed of economies in the world, the United States at the time of its independence was primarily an agricultural state. And then you saw how it in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it began to industrialize to such an extent that at the end of World War II, 50% of the global GDP, or nearly half of everything that was manufactured in the United States. So the US became a major industrial power from the late 19th century to the first half of the 20th century. And then it started transitioning towards services. And now nearly 80% or 79% of the US GDP comes from basically services. IT services, movies, Netflixes, scientific discoveries, etc. Even though a large segment of the US economy comes from services, it does have a large industrial base. In fact, I think America is still the second biggest manufacturing country in the world, even though the share of manufacturing in the US is only 10%. That 10% is over $3 trillion. That would be 75% of India's entire GDP, and probably 5 or 6 times bigger than India's, which is rapidly on the verge of becoming the third biggest economy. So the manufacturing sector of the US is actually bigger than that of Japan as well as Germany, who are in the top 5 economies. So basically, most countries have shown that trend that they have moved from the agricultural sector towards the manufacturing and then towards services in that order. So now, in this conversation, I want to basically address this particularly question, which has become very germane in today's politics, where India is competing with China to replace China as the world's factory. Because of security reasons, geopolitical competition between the West and China, because of what happened during COVID, the Western countries have become very wary about depending on China. And so they have realized their enormous dependency. So they're trying to redefine supply chains and trying to relocate manufacturing outside China. So some countries are trying to de-link from the Chinese economy. Some are trying to basically de-risk, which means it's China plus one. So they would like to have an alternative to China. And so, for example, for iPhones, Apple's strategy is China plus India. So most of its iPhones are made in China, but those that are exported to the US are made in India. So companies and countries are trying to find some ways of reducing their dependence on China, and number two, trying to basically secure their supply chains in case the geopolitics between the West and China results in some kind of a Cold War and essentially segregation and separation and bifurcation of the global economy. One part centering around China and the other around the West. G7 and European Union would be the main parts of that part of the economy. But India is trying to take advantage of this particular geopolitical tension by essentially reaching out to the West, trying to come up with free trade agreements with the US, with Europe. It has already got one with Great Britain, in which it is trying to present India as an alternative to China as a global factory. And in some areas, it is moving fast, like the iPhones and in the pharmacy. But India lags far behind China. So my question today is this particular strategy of India the right strategy Given the commonly shared wisdom that countries move from agriculture to manufacturing to services. So what I intend to do in this short conversation is basically explore that by looking at a few examples of countries from each of those sectors, and then maybe by the end of this discussion, we will be able to ask the question whether this is the right strategy, especially given the fact that India has placed so much importance and has attached so much significance to what it calls as Atmanirbhar or self-reliance in the industrial sector. And so for the last like 20, 30 years, and especially in the last 10 years, under the current dispensation in DC, we have heard a lot of talk about promoting manufacturing, inviting industries, inviting foreign investments, bringing in foreign technology, and making India self-reliant in manufacturing. And so this word Atmanirbhar has been bandied around a lot, both in the general economy as well as in the national security sector, where India wants to become independent of its dependence on foreign technology and foreign industry. But we haven't seen any significant progress in terms of manufacturing's share of GDP. In fact, it has continued to decline. At one point, it used to be 17%, but in the past few years, it has gone down to such an extent that only 14% of India's GDP comes from manufacturing. So given all of that and the rise of China, in fact, China 2.0 is all about manufacturing. So in that context, is it actually a smart thing to focus so much? In fact, when I say focus, it's not just talk. The government policies, the government subsidies are all designed to promote industrialization, resources which will otherwise be used elsewhere. That's the whole point of evaluating this particular strategy. So let's look at the data that I have compiled for you. This is GDP shared by sector and GDP per capita of several countries. So I have picked two countries, which are Afghanistan and Pakistan in India's neighborhood, which are low-income economies. And then I have picked India and China, which are middle-income economies. And then I have picked up Japan, USA, and Germany, which are high-income economies. Actually, the World Bank has four categories: low income, low middle income, high middle income, and high income. So Afghanistan and Pakistan are in low income economies, more or less. India is in the lower middle income. China is in the upper middle income or higher middle income. And USA, Japan, Germany are high income economies. And then in the columns, the first column is about the share of agriculture. The second is the share of manufacturing. And the third column is services. And then you can see how wealthy the country is by looking at the GDP per capita. So if you look at Afghanistan, it is the poorest country in the whole lot. Its GDP per capita is $364 US, which is about roughly $30 a month. So $1 a day. So Afghans live on $1 a day. That is the per capita income. It is really a poor country. And if you look at it, you will find that agriculture is 1/3 of the economy. It is not the biggest sector. It is not the biggest sector, but it is definitely a very important part of it. And services are 45%. We live in a society where we need a lot of services. So most countries will have services as something developed because of the fact that we live in a world which is post-industrial in many ways. So if you look at Afghanistan, it's 35.8% is the manufacturing. So you can see how little industrialization has taken place in Afghanistan. But notice that it does have a pretty developed, relatively speaking, service sector, or at least nearly half of its economy seems to be coming from the service sector. If you look at Pakistan, roughly 1/4 of its economy is dependent on agriculture, and its manufacturing is 13.5%, and its services are 55.9%. And if you look at India, India's agricultural sector is again bigger than its manufacturing, which is just 14%, and its services is 65%. So if you look at manufacturing and services, India and Pakistan look more or less very similar in their state of development. Whereas when you look at agriculture, you see that Pakistan is a bit more agricultural dependent than India is. And then if you look at China, this is where the bifurcation begins. So basically, Afghanistan and Pakistan are low income. India is lower middle income. If you look at its GDP per capita, it's nearly 2,700 plus. So it is, oh my God, more than 8 times, I guess, Afghanistan, and $1,000 plus. So $1,200 more than Pakistan. Nearly, you could say, well, 60-70% bigger in Pakistan. But then if you look at China, you see the share of agriculture drop significantly to just 7.1%, and its manufacturing goes up to 0.25%. And it also has a developed service sector, obviously, because in fact, if you just look at the IT services of China are at close to $800 billion, which is equal to US and India combined. So if you look at the Chinese IT industry, the hardware is about $1 trillion, and the software are about 800. So it's a massive economy in many ways. But look at its per capita income; it's just $12,000. And then when you move into the high income economies, you see Japan and the US. Only 1% of the GDP comes from agriculture. In fact, it is fascinating to see that the US in its trade negotiations is putting so much pressure on countries like Japan, on India, on other countries like Bangladesh and others to open their agricultural sector for America's farmers to export. But 1% of the US GDP comes from agriculture. So that is really very amazing to see. And 77% comes from services. So these are post-industrial societies. Even though America is the second biggest industrial power on earth, it is a post-industrial society because only 10% of its GDP, which is $3 trillion, comes from manufacturing. And then if you look at Germany is even less than 1%, and its services are 70%. So if you look at all the high-income economies, all of them, in fact, Great Britain is, I think, at 80%. All of their, shall we say, economy is driven by services. I want to give you an example of another major country, which you will be very surprised. If you look at Singapore, for example, Singapore's 72% of its GDP comes from services and 18% from manufacturing, which is quite surprising for a country that is so small. But agriculture is 0.03%. It's a small island. There's not much place for Singapore to do farming, etc. It does have an industrial base. I'm surprised that if you look at this chart, it is as on par with Germany when it comes to manufacturing in terms of the share of the GDP, and it has more services and far less agriculture than Germany. So the point that I'm trying to make is very simple. If you look at the countries from least developed to the most developed, the least developed countries have a great share of their GDP coming from agriculture. And the most developed countries have the greatest share of their GDP coming from services. And manufacturing should be respectable, around 20% would be great. In the case of China, it is a bit more because China is a very special country. So for example, if you look at this chart, and if you look, China's manufacturing is now roughly 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity. Half of everything that is manufactured in the world comes from China. So the world economy is about $110 trillion. And so about 10% of that or a little less than that is industrial output. And you can see that China is producing $4.16 trillion is this manufacturing output, equal to all of India's economy actually this year. Whereas India's manufacturing is just $780 billion, Germany is 845, the US is $2.5 trillion. So if you look at it in that sense that China has become a manufacturing giant, but even though it is so heavily dependent on manufacturing, you do realize that only 26% of its GDP comes from manufacturing, which means a quarter of China's economy is equal to half of the world's manufacturing. So keep that in mind in terms of understanding this. So given this data, is it smart for India to continue to move in this direction? So is the Singapore model the more interesting model for India? But India has land. India has poor people. There are over 700 million people who depend on agricultural income. And India has been trying to move them into the industrial sector, which requires a lot of infrastructure and a lot of capital intensive investments. There are people like Raghuram Rajan who say he was a former director of the RBI. I was also talking to my son, who is also a budding economist, and all of them say that you really need to now invest and focus on your services sector. And there are some countries which are focusing and are doing a better job than India, like Vietnam and even Mexico and Malaysia and maybe even Indonesia on manufacturing. And given the geopolitics of the world at the moment, it may not be very wise for India to get into competition, not just with China, but with Vietnam and others. What India can do is to use its already highly developed IT industry, IT services industry, which is the third biggest in the world, and I think try to make that the major driver of its economy. It already is. So, for example, India had a great first quarter in this 25-26 fiscal year. India's growth rate was 7.8%. It was the fastest growing economy in the world, the fastest growing major economy in the world. There are smaller economies which are growing at 20-30%. But it is the fastest growing major economy in the world. But even though its growth was 7.8, it was driven by services, which was around 9.3%. So the biggest driver of India's economic growth in the past several years has been the services sector. Services means not just IT, it can be movies, it can be restaurants, it can be hotels, it can be tourism, etc. So I think perhaps while I understand that for national security reasons, you need to focus on Atmanirbharta or becoming self-reliant, like Donald Trump is trying to make America self-reliant in the national security industrial sector, manufacturing. It would be crazy to go to war with China and then find that all your weapons are manufactured by China. Can you imagine that? Or at least the components that go into your weapons are manufactured in China and China turns the tap off. So in a long war, you'll be at a great disadvantage. Yeah, if you're fighting for 4 or 5 days, yes, you can buy and fight. But if you're fighting for 2, 3, 4 years, like the Russia-Ukraine war, then you need to be able to make to fight. And to make, you need to have the industrial infrastructure for your national security and your national defense. So I understand there, even if it's a loss-making enterprise, India should and can and will invest in that sector. But I think perhaps India needs to start thinking that it needs to focus far more, and in order to become a developed country, increase the share of services in its overall economy. But in order to do that, India will have to really improve the quality of its education system. For some reasons, people think that India's education system is good because Indians are doing well overseas. But that's not really the case. There are a large number of schools which are okay and good, like the IIMs and the IITs. But then you move away from that core, and then you suddenly find that the quality of education being provided is not adequate. That's one reason why Vietnam and Mexico and are winning the China plus one strategy, and India is not, because they are producing more skillful workers than India is. So, so I think India needs to ask this question whether going through this route of agriculture, manufacturing, and then services, uh, putting a lot of resources in manufacturing, is that the smartest way that India can develop? Why not invest more uh, in uh, in the services sector? Uh, Perhaps that is a question for the Indian planners to consider. But I do want to point that out that we are living in a world where it is becoming in a major way post-industrial, partly because of China's incredible capacity and efficiency to manufacture goods at very low prices, at very high quality. So there are other countries like Rwanda in Africa, where they are using digital innovation and digital technology and services to become a rapidly developed country. Singapore is another example of a country which is actually much younger than India. India became independent in 1947 and Singapore in 1966. It was a poor agricultural island in 66, and today its per capita income is 92,000. It is richer than all the rich countries here. In fact, if you make an adjustment for purchasing power parity, by some estimates, Singapore's per capita income is $150,000. So it's a very rich country and heavily dependent and driven by services, even though it does have quite a robust manufacturing sector. So I think perhaps India could rethink its development strategy and start emphasizing more on building an infrastructure that will sustain innovation and high quality education to feed into the service industry. So anyway, thank you for watching Conversations. If you have not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtada Khan. Take care.